Hi everyone, it's Reedy with MidiStrata. I'm going to introduce you to what MidiStrata is, walk you through creating a configuration for a simple demo, and finally demonstrating how MidiStrata is really useful during an actual performance. So what is MidiStrata? Without using marketing terms, MidiStrata is software that watches the MIDI messages coming from master keyboard, processes those messages according to a configuration, and then send the processed messages out to various synthesizers. So over the years, I've been a gigging musician with various musical projects playing both original and cover music. Always present was a struggle with how to physically manage multiple keyboards, how to play various song parts, particularly on cover songs, while the audience is expecting what they heard on their albums. I tried many so-called MIDI appliances like the Yamaha MEP4 MIDI event processor and others along the way, but they always fell short of my expectations and needs. So I set out to develop my own solution. It started as a dedicated DIY project using a Motorola 6800 CPU with software and assembly code. It made its way there to the personal computer environment with the code transitioning from assembly, Pascal, Basic, C, and C++. Today, MidiStrata is a C# application that runs on Windows or Mac. So we need to talk about devices. So a device that consumes MIDI messages are unified into a logical network of destinations that I'm calling endpoints. And an endpoint really is a MIDI output. It's usually a patch on a channel in a multi-timbral tone generator. The so-called network is comprised of all the MIDI interfaces found on the PC. So it's a combination of whatever, single port or multi-port USB interfaces, virtual ports like the Loop MIDI or instrument VSTs, or RTP MIDI to get over the WAN, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth. There's this notion of a layer, and a layer is the virtual representation of the endpoint, and a layer has 45 plus parameters and a whole bunch of logical operations in it. Layers are collected into what is called a strata, and a strata can have up to 128 layers. And then the actual application of MidiStrata supports multiple instances. So there's a lot there. It can be over-configured. MIDI, of course, is well known for its latency, depending on how you're actually using it. But there's enough tools and configuration capabilities that we can really manage that quite well. So in this demo, we're focusing on the use case of a typical keyboard musician using a master keyboard and various tone generators. But I want to say that MidiStrata is really agnostic in terms of what, why, and how it's used. So any device generating MIDI messages is a candidate for a controller, and any device responding to MIDI messages are endpoint candidates. Think integrations of wind and guitar controllers or EDM, DJ environments, DMX lighting systems, esoteric Bluetooth devices for audience participation. All those things can be connected into MidiStrata, controlled by MidiStrata. So it's really limited only by our imagination. And MidiStrata provides the environment to enable these ideas. Simple as that. So we have a keyboard with polyphonic aftertouch. External pedals, these are foot switches. They're assigned functions in MidiStrata for controlling Leslie, selecting layers, etc. We come out of the Hydrosynth and we go into the laptop computer. That's where the MidiStrata application is actually running. And we also have wireless connections into an iPad. And I'm running a companion Lemire application to control MidiStrata. We then go into the Oasis. It has channel aftertouch, so it's kind of fun. We've got channel aftertouch here, and we've got polyphonic aftertouch there. That's useful for us. And it has this whole complement of controllers on here that we're going to leverage as well. We have knobs and faders, switches, and we have the pads here. We're leveraging the so-called external mode, and we're redirecting the knobs, the sliders, the switches, and the pads to control MidiStrata. The Oasis is doing double duty as a multi-timbral tone generator. Important to note that both synthesizers are in the local off mode. They transmit on channel 16. The Hydrosynth is listening on channel 16, while the Oasis is listening on channels 1 through 15. Now that we described the logical aspects of the demo, let's look at the actual physical connections. So we have a whole bunch of different things here. We have, of course, the hydrosynth, which we talked about, that has the expression pedal actually connected to it. We have a merger, which has 2 inputs and 1 output. I have this neat 19-inch rack device from MIDI Solutions called the F8. It takes up to 8 quarter-inch contact closures. It merges those contact closures with whatever data comes in on the MIDI and sends it out to port. And then I have a Nectar 4-port interface, but I'm only using 2 ports. It's a USB interface into the computer, and of course the computer has wireless connections to the iPad. We actually have the Oasis, and again we're using the in, the out, and the through, and keep in mind that whatever comes in never goes out, it goes through. And back to the hydrosynth. So the first thing we want to do is we connect the hydrosynth into the MIDI merger. From the merger we go and pick up all our contact closures, so now we actually have our hydrosynth with our expression pedal and our pedals logically acting as the same unit. We come out of the MIDI Solutions into the Nectar input, and from the USB we go into the MidiStrata, which is a 2-way communication. We then go into the Oasis and through the Oasis back into the hydrosynth. And then finally out of the Oasis back into the merger. So here's our whole physical connection. Again, looks like we've got some MIDI feedback, but we don't, because the Oasis is actually operating with the local off as well as the hydrosynth. And we're taking advantage of the through capabilities of both the. Actually, we're not actually using the through in the hydrosynth. We could connect another one here if we connect it to the through, but again, we only have 2 devices. So let's just recap the channels, because it's really important that we get those channels right as we move into configuration. So, most importantly, MidiStrata application, it receives on channel 16, it transmits on channels 1 through 16. So because that receives on channel 16, both master keyboards need to transmit on 16, and we have that here with the hydrosynth transmitting on 16, as well as the Oasis transmitting on 16. Because this output's on the channels 1 through 16, the Oasis responds to channels 1 through 15, and the hydrosynth responds to channel 16. So that wraps up the logical aspect and the physical aspect. It's now time to launch MidiStrata and actually configure this. Time to set up the software inside of MidiStrata for our demo. I've launched it from the operating system. First thing we need to do is go to Setup, select the Strata Wizard. We need to select an input port. That's the MIDI Flex 4. It's going to be on channel 16. We need an output port. That's on the 4, but it's the number 3rd one here. And finally, we need to say we need 16 layers in our Strata. Create. We're going to call it IMA demo. And here's our basic configuration of a Strata. So let's go to Strata, and here's our 16 layers. Let me scroll down a bit here. And I'm going to name these. So this is going to be acoustic piano. And let me go offline and name these things so it's not boring to watch me type this in. So we're back from naming our layers some useful names. Now let's look at this area called selectors. This is where a lot of the action takes place. We see a whole bunch of blocks, 16 of them. We see one that's green. That means it's enabled. If I play my musical keyboard, we can hear it. The ones that are red are obviously not on. If I select several ones, we can hear them all together. Let's go back to none and go back and select just the piano. So let's start to set up some sounds we want to use for our demo. So I like to use the electric piano and the piano together. So let's hear them. We like that. We'll take a snapshot. I'm going to call these pianos. I also like to add strings at various points with those two pianos. So we'll add the strings to it and take a snapshot of that as well. I'll call this P and strings. I also like using horns at different points, so let's turn the strings off and add the horns and take a snapshot of that as well. We'll call this P and horns. Let me spell it right. By the way, let's save this. I did before, but let's save it one more time. And it's the demo, so let's say yes so we don't lose everything we have. So let's go to the snapshot screen, and we can see we've got 3 snapshots. We can actually undock that, and I can manipulate my window here. Change the shape a little bit. Let's bring that down over here. And let's go back to the selectors, and let's also make that current. So now, if we go back to pianos, let me move my ASCII keyboard. If I select this, notice I have the sustain pedal down, and everything's holding. If I hit the strings, horns, these snapshots can be controlled by all sorts of remote controls as well. So we have some basic sounds here. Now, the other thing I like to do is I definitely like having organ, and usually when I turn an organ on, I usually like to have the Leslie moving fast. So let's stop everything by saying none, and let's just listen to the organ for a minute. So I'm going to create a translation based upon some pedals I have on the floor. We saw those in the diagram, where when I press the pedal, we're going to make the Leslie go fast. So that's in an area under details called translation. We're going to create a new translation, and we're going to use the learn function to look at the actual device that it's coming from. So I'm pressing my pedal, and I see these turn red, and I take the learn off. We see where it's coming from, and as my pedal, I'm going to say a range of values from 0 to 127. The message type is going to be translated to is a controller. And on the Oasis, it's the modulation controller that changes the Leslie speed, so we'll select that. And as far as the YY value, where it comes from, it's the same as the input. The destination, in this case, is going to be to a layer number, or layer name, because I named them. And we're going to select the organ, and we're going to say add, and now that should work. As it does. Now, the other thing I want to do is when I enable the organ layer, I want the Leslie to go fast. So we're going to add another action, so we can say add. And in this case, it's only when the pedal is down, so it's 127. 127. The type of message is actually what's called an application control. The destination type is to layer control. The destination is enable layer. And the state would be to set it on. And the layer is the organ. We're going to update that. Update this. That should work. Let's close this. Go back to our selectors. Let's just say none. I press the pedal and the organ is enabled. Let me just turn it off one more time. And let's add a piano. Now when I press the pedal, the organ's on with Leslie fast, but if I release the pedal, the organ stays on, but the Leslie slow. So I like that from a performance standpoint. So now that I have basic sound set up for my demo performance, let me do one more thing. Let's go back to the mapping, and I'm going to set up the connection for the remote iPad because we're going to actually use that at the Oasis. So we go back to the mapping, and we're now looking for some inputs, and that would be from the Lemire Master MMI. We click that, bring that down. We're going to connect it up to this instance, and that happens to communicate on channels 16, 15, and 14. We need to go out to the Lemire, so that would be to Lemire. Bring that down over here and connect this up. That's it. Better save. Control S. That's it for the configuration. The next area will be actually a performance on the Oasis with the iPad as a remote. We're now at the point where we're actually going to demonstrate MidiStrata. I'm sitting in front of the Oasis. I have the iPad as a remote control. I've configured MidiStrata to look at these controls on the Oasis, these pads, and I decided to make them enablers for these 8 layers, as you can see. And they're toggles. I also have the faders over here, which are volume controls. So if we look at the piano as an example, we can control that volume. And I have the knobs up here for the other layers. So I have really 16 layers here. Remember, we can go up to 128 layers, so how would you do that on a Oasis? You wouldn't. So 16 layers makes a lot of sense for the Oasis. First, I'm going to set levels and things.